All right, man, I'm on. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good. Another happy Thursday getting started. Had a good week last week, man. A great guest that we had on. If you hadn't
Yeah.
seen the Richard Mellick video with the Bible without error, go back. Don't even watch this one. Stop what you're doing. Go back and watch it. You'll be enriched as a result.
Yeah, it was so good. I was just in awe again. I just love Dr. Mellick so much, and he's just so brilliant and so wise and just so such a gentleman, So it was really wonderful to see him again.
Truly a gentleman and a scholar.
And then he just like slowly unloads more. And it's like, oh, you want me to go a little deeper? And then you're like, wow,
Yeah.
And when he talked about the reason he's an inerrantist and went to Jesus, I was like, wow, that is such a great apologetic too. So
I used that like right when I got off. I went because I'm over at Grand Canyon University. I used it like 2 hours later with my students as I'm teaching Bible survey. I was like, this is so good. We need to talk about it. And it actually just so happened we were talking about how Jesus used the Bible that day. So good stuff. All right, but that's not what we're talking about today.
No.
You picked the topic today. What are we talking about?
I did. I've been hearing about this thing called quiet quitting, and thought that would be an interesting thing to talk about. Quiet quitting, what is it? And is it something that's actually impacting the church as well? And what is the Christian response to the temptation to be a quiet quitter? We can define that and get into it. Would you like to open in prayer first? And then
let's do it. And then let's talk about quiet quitting.
All right. Join me in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. All right, man. So this does have to do with the quiet quitting. It's another way of just saying, right, like just not caring and just getting lazy at the job, right? Like just giving up and just doing the minimum. Right. I mean, it's just a repackaged way to say, I do the bare minimum and I don't care, but I still want to get paid.
Yeah. And I heard about this. I'd just seen some stories, and then I was at a Dave Ramsey conference and they were talking about the Great Resignation, which we did a video on. So feel free to go look at that one. And now there are people that are they're talking about the Great Regret, those that jumped ship without thoughtfully working through the issues and found out that the grass wasn't greener on the other side. And then there's this group that are the quiet quitters. And this is a group of people who will not quit, but they're not going to give their best effort. And so they're going to do the bare minimum of the job requirement. They're not going to put in any extra effort. And essentially, they're kind of trying to make the employer make a determination whether they're worthy to be terminated or not. And of course, we've had stuff like this before, but a lot of this is coming out of COVID and out of the reality that a lot of people really enjoyed the remote work and having a certain degree of autonomy that they didn't have. And now they're being called back and requirements are coming back. And a lot of people don't want to necessarily engage to the same level they were engaged before. And some people argue that this is just people actually developing healthy boundaries. And it's the employer's fault that they've been putting so much stringent requirements on people that they finally had a break and realized that they don't want to do this anymore. But I think there's a legitimate reality that God's called us to excellence. He's called us to dig in, to do things with all of our strength. And so quiet quitting, in my mind, is really an unethical reality. You may need to get a different job if you've got an employer who's not operating in a proper way and is expecting too much. But the reality is, if you're not all in on your job, then you're kind of robbing yourself of the fruit of labor to some degree. So I thought that would be an interesting topic. Yeah. And then how does that relate to the church? So
good. Well, I mean, so here's what I think we should deal with: the idea of just I kind of, the way I was thinking about this is looking at like a biblical theological approach to work in general, and what that should look like and what that should mean. But I'd like to hear too, because I know you've had time to kind of look through it, is of how does that translate into what they're seeing in church? So if you'll speak to that for a second, because then I think as we talk about what is the biblical understanding of what work should look like, what is the connection that the article makes between quiet quitting and church? Is that attendance? Is that volunteering? What is that? What are they saying?
Yeah, so the article that I found was actually by Russell Moore, who used to be running the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for the Baptist, and he's now writing with Christianity Today and doing other things. But he wrote an article about don't quite quit the church, and he kind of uses the idea to kind of jump off and talk about pastors who are really just not feeling engaged anymore, and that the last few years, the battles that we've had in church over how we're going to respond to mandates and different things, and the infighting going on, and then in his mind, the over politicalization of the church are reasons that a lot of people are checking out of the church, and he's urging people not to do that because he gives an example of a young guy who's just so excited about getting into ministry. His grandpa was a mechanic and an evangelist, and that's what he wants to do. That instance just snapped even Russell Moore out of it, that there's great hope on the horizon, and that we shouldn't have this demoralized attitude in the workplace or in the church. And so, I think it'd be good to kind of maybe dive in deeper than he did on some of these things, because this also talks into some of the things that we have seen with regards to certain populations not coming back, or our best volunteers that took a break during COVID are coming back, but they're not volunteering and they're not engaged. Yeah. And a lot of it, again, is I think a fear of overwhelming, taking on too much again. And then just, I think at the reality, we do have a certain sense of laziness in our spiritual mission. And of course, there are pastors too that they've been demoralized and they aren't really engaging in Christ's calling with the zeal that they ought to. So,
well, and I would agree. And I think that's where I think we've got to get back down to the remedy of, because people have been lazy and not taking their vocation seriously. People have, especially today, where I think we have a very culturally we have a really messed up view of what work is and why we need it. And how am I supposed to view my vocation is there because of course there's the big secular and then there's like the spiritual divide. And so many times we divide those two up. And I know that was something that, the Protestant Reformation helped to kind of recover this idea that what we do is not we're not you're not just a Christian and then you got to go and you do your secular job, but like that we should be looking at the profession that I'm involved with as something that's spiritual as well, that it's not that we have spiritual jobs and secular jobs. And so I think that's important to kind of work through, because if that's the case, if there's biblical support for that, then that should change how I view my serving in my church, how I view my serving if I'm working at the barbecue restaurant and I'm, I just don't like it anymore. And so I'm just going to put bare minimum into my job. So just enough so I don't get fired. I don't know if that's anything else you want to talk about. I definitely want to look at some of those passages together if you're up for it.
Yeah, I think having a theology of work is a really good starting place. And so again, I think the Old Testament guy might be the one to lead out on this, but I'm already thinking about creation, and of course in the New Testament, the instruction of Jesus about viewing ourselves as a slave, and we've only received what we ought to. And so there's a really good biblical guidance on these things. But do you want to walk through it that way, or would you rather just speak more anecdotally what we're seeing for a little bit more?
Well, that's the thing is where it's one thing to just say, here's what we're seeing, right? I do see a lack of people involved caring anymore about getting back into their roles of serving. And I will say this, I think that if you used to be, but you're no longer serving, you're a church member who doesn't serve anymore. I do think you need to stop for just a moment and you need to evaluate, what excuse am I giving for not? Because I think what happens with church members is the way that if you want to call it quiet quit or whatever, to use the terminology today, the way that they do it is they deceive themselves of why it's okay to not serve. Biblically speaking, you've been given a gift and God has asked you to give it. You're part of the body. And if you remember what Paul talks about, that we've all been built up for the body. We all have gifts to serve. If you're not serving, you are in disobedience. Yet I've heard this already in church before too. oh, you've done your time. It's time for you to just enjoy. No, retirement does not happen in church, in ministry. And what I mean by that is obviously you're going to need to retire from some capacity, but you never stop serving the Lord. So sure, your role could change, but that doesn't mean that I've done my part. And I see this with church, but I've seen this a long time prior even to the pandemic. I've done my part, Pastor. I served in babies. I'm burned out. I'm not doing this anymore. And so, okay, so maybe God doesn't want you with babies, or maybe you have to have a heart job take place first so that you will love children and want to serve. But so I think that's the first way, is I've done my part, and I need me time, and I just need to enjoy sitting back. That's one way to do it. And so I think that's why people feel comfortable. The other thing I think people need to evaluate is I might step on some toes with this one. How long are you going to milk the pandemic excuse for why you can't get back in there? Right? Because a lot of people say, oh, I'm just nervous about being back around so many people. But let me ask you this. When was the last time did you go to a restaurant recently? You've been to a sporting event or a movie theater, or grocery store? How have you done so far? Right.
Yeah.
I do think that if church is like if you're using that excuse and trying to get some mileage off that, just make sure that you're consistent here. Because I don't quite get that. If you're deathly afraid, that's one thing. But if your life shows that you're afraid in no other areas, but when it comes to coming back and serving and being involved in using your gifting again, then I think you need to evaluate that and just make sure you're not deceiving yourself of why you don't want to serve and volunteer and use the gifting God has given you. So that's my initial thoughts on this, Andrew.
Yeah, and I agree. I think there's always been a group that kind of digs in and gives it their all. The old 20-80% rule, that 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And I think what's hurt is a lot of our 20%ers didn't come back. And so you're down to kind of a 10% that have picked up the slack, or churches are closing, Yeah. And this is happening. Again, we're trying to relate what's happening in the general economy to the church. But it has made it difficult on those. And you kind of are looking at a selfishness that's underlying this, and just devaluing God's call. There's always going to be those that just don't take seriously what God has called. An excuse I've heard is, I give 10% so I don't have to labor. I don't have to do these service jobs. And it's like, well, many of us are giving and we're working and serving. And, again, it's a matter of the kingdom needs workers, so I'm going to labor. I'm going to pray for harvesters. I'm going to get out there and get working. And I think a lot of it really is psychological. You're either buying into a lie of the devil that you've done enough, right? If you've done enough, then Christ will take you out and take you home. That's where we're going to get our rest. Unless, of course, he's going to take your health away so that maybe you can be an object of ministry for those that are pouring in and taking care of those in need. But the reality is, if you're healthy and able, you should be excited, enthusiastic to serve the Lord. And if you're a pastor listening to this, you need to try to hang in and discern God's calling. And again, we talked about, maybe it is time to move in that previous video. But if it's not time to move, then you really do have to recognize that you're serving Christ. And in serving Christ, are you going to give him the bare minimum? And it really should convict us that we're not there. But I think a lot of people I think a lot of this is coming out of depression. I think a lot of this is psychological, and there is just so low motivation. Even though you might even want to engage, you just can't seem to get there because there's been just a beating mentally and emotionally over the last couple of years. And you may need to heal a little bit. If the desire's there and there's just something that's not clicking, you need to heal and pray and seek guidance, maybe seek some counseling. That might help. But if the desire is not even there and you're just content to be a lazy kingdom worker, the Bible has some things to say.
Yeah, it does, for sure.
So
slothfulness.
Yeah.
Well, so let's deal with this, because I know this is a much shorter video this time. So I have some New Testament thoughts, and then I have one Old Testament thought. So here's the New Testament thought that I jumped to think. The first thing when you and I were talking about this, just texting about what we were going to do, I think of first off, like Colossians 3, where verse 22, it says, slaves, obey your human masters in everything. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but work wholeheartedly fearing the Lord. So, I mean, let's just be real. In the Roman Empire, I remember was it like 90% is slave, something like that. It's insane. It might've been 80. It's an insane number of what is the population as slaves. And like I said, I'm probably butchering the stats. It's huge, but think about that. Like, okay, obviously slavery is not something that you're going to be highly motivated. Now, granted, there in that time is obviously different than 2022, and we reflect on our country's history, or even just the past 500 years or 600 of slavery, how it's been done. But at that time, obviously, slavery. You've got people that are there, and recognize that even then, he's having to say, like, don't just work while you're being watched. It's not the ideal situation to be a slave, but there is the tendency for them to say, I'm only going to do this while this dude's around, and I'm going to kick back. But he says, don't do that. Don't do this. And then he goes, whatever you do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not for people, knowing that you will receive a reward of an inheritance from the Lord. If you serve the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong he has done, and there is no favoritism. So that's that one thing I think of, right? Is that you're going to be, whatever you do, that 23, do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not for people. And so I think that's a big thing for us, of whether I'm serving in the church as a volunteer for children, whether I'm serving at McDonald's, or you're a pastor, in every capacity, or you hate your job right now. And until you jump to a new position or whatnot, though, we're called to first and foremost serve as unto the Lord. I like the old English translation on that. I like that because it sticks in my, as unto the Lord, right? That everything we do for him. So he is ultimately my boss, first and foremost, not the dude yelling. I remember being in high school or first year of college. I was working at Burger King. I was 17 years old, getting chewed out in front of everybody, even customers, about how to mop better, right? And my response could have been to just be done with it there, or I could say, okay, I work first, not for this jerk who's chewing me out, but for the Lord, right? And so how do I keep that in mind as I serve, even in that capacity? So that's the first place that I kind of initially went to. What do you think?
Yeah, and I'll throw in some Old Testament stuff here, since you jumped into the new. God took man and placed him in Eden to tend the garden.
Yeah.
Genesis 2:15. Work was established before the fall. And if you've got an allergic reaction to work, you're not going to like heaven very much, because I think we're going to have work to do in heaven. It was not painful toil. It was not toil that was tied to our survival until after the fall, which I think, because of those realities and the result of sin, sometimes people look at work as a means to an end rather than a means to glory God and to give him honor by the work of our hands. And so especially, and this is, again, like you brought up, retirement. Adam should have retired, right? Adam had everything he needed. He had no want. And so he could have retired in the Garden of Eden for eternity, but he was given a job after becoming financially independent. And so that reality is something I think we should bear in mind, that the work doesn't stop until God calls us home, and then he might have some spiritual work for us to do in eternity. We're called to work. We ought to really enjoy it. Ecclesiastes, which is probably one of the most cynical books of the Bible, and one of the ones that I've struggled with. You're an Old Testament guy, that you might do better with it than I do. But as the Kohelet, as our proclaimer, if this is Solomon or someone else, as he's giving forth his wisdom, he calls us in chapter 9, whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might.
Yeah.
So whatever you find yourself in, whatever vocation you have fallen into, whether you chose to or God kind of just brought you there, you should do it with all your might, because that labor is your reward, essentially. And that is something that is so often missed, is that there is value in hard work. And it used to be something that was taught more often. I think today a lot of people are thinking, if I'm not getting paid what I'm worth, then I shouldn't give them any extra effort, because they're abusing me or something along these lines. And it's really just a very counter perspective from the scripture, that again, if you're actually being abused or mistreated, get a different job. There's lots of opportunity in America today.
Yeah.
If the reality is that you just feel entitled to more, you may need to grow up a little bit, because most of us are doing a lot more than we're worth. We are working harder, we're doing more and getting paid less than we're worth. And we don't complain. We just do it because it's to God.
Yeah.
And God is just. So if I'm actually working hard and I'm engaging in the best of my abilities, what is before me, and I'm doing extra, God is going to see to it that that's rewarded. He's just, not just on a sin plane, but also on a works plane. And so if I'm not rewarded in this life for it, then man, I'm really building a heavenly retirement home. That's going to be pretty fantastic. And so I think that's another thing that just kind of keeps you going in the midst of it, is like, I'm doing it for Christ. I'm doing it for eternity. And so I'm going to give it my all, even though no one's looking.
Yeah. And I would say, yeah, you're right. If your response is, I'm not making enough here, I mean, you should make sure that you're not going to make your jump simply about money. Like, you need to consider the Lord. Like, if the Lord is in all of this too, consider, it might be that the Lord is pushing you to take that new job because maybe you have a skill set, or maybe you have something that it's time to make that jump. And so it's not wrong to say, I'm going to do it, but regardless of where you're at, maybe you think you deserve more. Until that job change comes, or until that raise, you're still called to keep working to the Lord, right? You're still called to work hard, to not just sit back and kick back. That's not what you should be doing. In fact, that's the other place I wanted to go to, is 2 Thessalonians, and Paul writes, right? He talks about earlier on in that chapter. He says in verse 7, chapter 3, verse 7, you yourselves know you should imitate us. We were not idle among you. We did not eat anyone's food free of charge. Instead, we labored and toiled, working night and day, so we would not be a burden to any of you. It is not that we don't have the right to support, but we did make it ourselves. We did it to make ourselves an example to you, so you would imitate us. In fact, when we were with you, this is what we commanded you. If anyone isn't willing to work, he should not eat. Now, we heard that there are some among you who are idle. They are not busy, but busybodies. Now, we command and exhort such people by the Lord Jesus Christ to work quietly, provide for themselves. And so, those are things that we see. Is the Bible is pretty clear. Like, if you're not willing to work, you don't need to eat. And so keep that in mind, right? What's my heart like in how I do my job? Am I doing it under the Lord, or am I doing it to myself? If you're working for yourself, I think you'll see very quickly, you'll be discouraged. You'll want to quit. You'll just sit back. You won't care. And you have no problem sucking people's time and money and just getting paid to do nothing. But if you work under the Lord, you recognize, like, there's a burden. He's called me to work. I'm here to work for him. It's a reflection of my hard work, as a reflection of him in my life. It's a reflection of his, and I'm glad you went there with Genesis. It's a reflection of something he wants all of us to do, which is to be put to work. And I'll tell you this, here's something I think I'm going to throw this out here. This is something we were talking about even last night in our Bible study. We're going through a marriage study with our small group. And one thing that's interesting is you look at the Adam and Eve stories, and, he's given a task, dominion, and to have dominion and subdue the earth, right? And he needs to do that task, but he also needs his wife to do that with him. He needs his helper. And I do think that there's an aspect too, where I think all Christians should be considering too, of, God, what is the tasks that you have called me to, and how do we as a family complete them? And so I think in two respects, the first respect we need to look at is Great Commission. That's the main one, right? You're still here for a reason. So Christian, God, you need to ask God, what have you given me as my job to be a witness, a disciple maker? And and then you need to talk with your family about, how do we work for this, and what is the vision for God's given our family? But then you also need to recognize, okay, so what is it that you're called to do as a worker? And what are you called to do as you labor? And how is it that your family is together, tied to that you as, especially if you're married, you guys are linked together in that purpose, that we are accomplishing the things that God has wired us for and built us for. And so I think this goes even deeper. than just simply, hey, do you like your work at your job? Well, make sure you do it for Jesus. Like it's how he's designed you as a husband and as a wife. It's designed you for as a human for taking on the tasks that are before you. And so, yeah, we do not have the ability, the right to just coast and chill. If you are there, just quit now, and don't just sit and hope somebody else takes care of you. Get to that place that you'll be. But I will say this: if you're, last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm done. If you're willing to coast and quit now and not work, even though you know you're on the way out, or even though you hate your job, I will say this: if that attitude's here and that persists even now, it will persist in the next, because you're going to hate the next one at some point too. And when things get bad, you're going to do the same thing. So you might know that you're not in your dream job right now, and you're training for that dream job, and maybe that dream job is just ahead, and you're not where you are, but because we've all been there, been in jobs where we knew, like, I'm not going to be here forever. But even in that job that you're not here forever, are you doing it under the Lord? Because if you're doing it for yourself, that heart piece translates into everything else. And so I get that whole premise. I bring it right back of how it affects everything, even my church attendance and volunteering as well. That's it. That's all I got.
That's great. You and I are pretty driven individuals, and that's not prideful. That might be a sticking point that might cause pride, but we've pushed pretty hard in a lot of different avenues. And generally, I was always trying to reach a certain point, and I got to my current position. I'm like, I finally arrived, but I was working tremendous hours, little kids, and I was doing networking, trying to get into different groups. And I went to a pastor's function, and it was on burnout. And nothing made me more anxious or frustrated than sitting in this meeting, because I was literally pushing, 80 to 100 hours a week and trying to teach, do an extra, picking up everything I could so that the family could make it, so my wife could stay home. And I'm sitting around with all these retiree aged pastors who are talking about burnout and what do you do, to rejuvenate. And, I swim every day, and I do. And I'm just boiling inside. Like, what I do is I work my guts out. I go to sleep, I wake up, and I do it again. And I hope that at some point I will reach a point where it calms down. And I really was on the edge. Of course, every time I get another position or improve, I find myself right in there. So I may have some boundary issues, but the reality is, so many of us are doing that way because we're so aware of the need. And the reason so many of us are in burnout is because so many people are so content to sit back and watch people who are willing to work, just work themselves raw. And I don't think the solution is for me to sit back and let someone else pick up the slack and watch things collapse while that doesn't happen. But the reality is, if you realize that you love one another, let's bring that one back. If you love the brothers and sisters, one of the things you can do is bear one another's burdens, and pick up your portion and maybe then some, and let's get to work in the kingdom. And if you're burned out, if you are lacking hope, and if this whole thing has messed with your head, you need to be in the Word. You need to be in the church. You need to be loved on. But sometimes the way through that is actually just by being obedient and doing the small things that God's placed before you, and building back maybe your stamina. Because I think that might be some of this as well, is that we've forgotten to work hard. And the last thing I'll say is From the Horse and His Boy. Okay, it's a great book by C.S. Lewis. At one point in that story, the horse is running from a lion, and this horse all of a sudden kicks it into a gear that it forgot it had. And it had been a slave horse. And when they went to war, being driven by the master, it could fight and go pretty hard. But being free now and carrying a rider, it had forgotten that it had all of this extra energy until the lion was chasing it. We find out later that the lion was actually Aslan driving them across the line. And the horse needed that extra pressure to realize it had more energy, more to give. I do think that those that really have kind of sat back, they've forgotten how many gears they have, that they've got some second winds, and they need to just really kind of engage again and get the stamina. And if you won't do it voluntarily, our King might have a way of motivating you. And I think that's where I'll leave it.
Hey, man, that's a good way to end it. I think it's a good, short, sweet, way to kind of think through this stuff. I think, in terms of time, our commitments for today and what we've got going on, I think it's good to just stop it here and be done. And I think I'll just say this one last thing is if you're in the church, you should pursue serving like you would any other job. Like who sits around and waits for the job to contact them so that they can finally get a job? You typically knock on doors and you check in. And yet we don't see that kind of stuff at the church. I think we should, though. I mean, don't wait for the ministry to talk to you. Start talking. If you see a need, start helping. But I think we just get so weird too, is like you put it out there and you say, we need help. And then people are all sitting thinking, they'll probably help. Just help, right? Or ask how you can help. And apply, to see how you can do it. So anyways, last I want to say on that.
And one way you can help us, because we are pretty strapped for time and we try to put these videos out, is taking a moment and subscribing and liking this video or on the audio to subscribe to the podcast, because again, that gives us a little bit of motivation to keep going, because we are pulled in a lot of directions. I know Dr. Pate over there is a very busy man. And again, there are days where we're like, maybe we just don't have time to do this anymore. If you think these are valuable, that'll help us know. So take some time to subscribe and like these videos, share it with a friend, and give God your all.
And that is not the work that we're talking about, though. That is not the substitute for the kind of work we were talking about today. So I just want to throw that one in there. Don't say you've done your part because you clicked like.
Yeah.
Well, hey, let's pray out, and then we're on. I got to head out, man.
Yeah.
All right. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look with favor on you and give you peace. God bless you guys. Thanks for watching and listening. We will talk to you later. Bye-bye, y'all. Bye.